Taking personal responsibility. Now, whether you've been involved in personal growth or self-help for a few days, a couple of weeks, a month or two, or even for many decades already, there's one idea at the very center of everything. And it's something I personally believe we can all continue to do a better job of applying it into our lives. So, what is this one idea, you may be wondering? Well, it's simply this. Taking personal responsibility for everything we do. Now, we can note that even if you think you already know everything about responsibility, stay with me here and listen to this carefully. And I promise I'll share some more detailed, deeper insights about this, which I know will serve you very well. So let's get into it. Let's start at the beginning. Whether we realize it or not, from an early age, almost all of us get conditioned to believe that responsibility is a scary, painful, or hurtful thing. And the words, "who did this?" or "whose fault is this?" said by a parent, a guardian, or a teacher, are rarely said in a happy tone, but rather in an angry and frustrated way. So when a parent or teacher tells us off saying, "who did this?" as kids, our usual first response can be to point that finger at someone or something else and take ourselves out of the firing line. It was him. It was her fault. It wasn't my fault. It was the... And here you insert the excuse of your choosing. And now, emotionally speaking, this makes perfect sense. Basically, we get to avoid any feeling of any kind of pain. We avoid conflict by pointing the finger at someone or something else. And because it works, we've usually stuck to this and will continue to use the tool of blame. The challenge is that when we repeat this behavior, whether we notice it first or not, it wires certain connections and reinforces certain beliefs in our brain. Beliefs such as responsibility hurts, blaming is easy, responsibility is hard, owning up to my mistakes is painful, blaming someone else is actually easy and it helps me. And then, based on these beliefs, we actually spend our lives thinking and actually acting in this way. And even when this behavior is challenged, such as is often in the great works of personal development, it actually creates some serious resistance. And the reason for this is twofold. One, repetition and conditioning. Firstly, we've done and repeated the same behavior or blaming other people and other things instead of taking responsibility ourselves. And this becomes our norm. And neurons that fire together wire together. So anything that we repeat over and over and over again with time becomes a habit, a default, and becomes normal for us to do. So much so that we often begin to do it subconsciously without realizing it. And point number two, we assume there's no downside. Like many of the most important things in life, such as health and well-being, for example, this behavior doesn't have any visible, tangible, short-term downside. In the same way that eating a single bar of chocolate or even a whole tub of ice cream does not make you fat right away. The visible outcomes only show up over time as you continue this behavior. In the same way, blaming doesn't have any short-term consequences to it either. So based on this, we tell ourselves it's an innocent act. We tell ourselves that it doesn't really matter and does not do us any harm. But that's just not the case. And here's why. You see, while we may not be able to see any harm that comes from us blaming other people, our genetics, our family, the government, the taxes, the economy, the weather, or the world for our poor performance or bad results in our lives, the truth is there's actually a massive cost to this. And that's because this behavior of blaming, instead of taking full personal responsibility for your results in life, affects you mentally and emotionally in a huge way. It takes away our personal power, bit by bit, until we're actually left with nothing but our victim status and poor results. So when we're in this mindset of blame and finger pointing, we have some financial challenges, for example, we don't take responsibility, but rather blame the boss, our job, the economy, the government, anything besides ourselves. We don't stop to look inwards. Now, sure, we work 8 till 4, 9 till 5, but not a minute more. Sure, we haven't read a book, educated ourselves further, expanded our skills since leaving school all those years ago. And sure, we've many businesses and income opportunities around us that we haven't done anything with for months. But we ignore all of this, or at least part of it. We hide it, or we suppress it. And why do we do this? Well, because it's just like those children we were all those years ago. It's still easier to point the finger at someone else than to take ownership and full responsibility. We go as far as to even ignore the facts that there are other people in the same economy who are actually succeeding financially. Now, deep down, we know these aren't fully viable excuses, but we push that thinking down. We suppress it. We don't want to hear it. We like our alibis in our excuses. They make us feel better. Short term, of course. So essentially, we're hitting snooze on our problems, failing to account for the true long-term consequences. So you see, while this way of thinking and acting, blaming, finger pointing, being a victim of life, actually gets us off the hook and allows us to avoid embarrassment, in the long term, it also makes us completely powerless. So being a victim, not taking responsibility, strips you of your personal power. It makes you weak. It makes you helpless. It makes you powerless. And every time you point a finger and blame someone or something besides yourself, you're mentally reinforcing to yourself that your results are not within your control. You're reinforcing that you cannot change the outcome. So, of course, you don't want to do anything about the situation. And this is because we, as human beings, are not motivated to do things we feel are actually outside of our control. It all becomes a very destructive, self-fulfilling prophecy. As soon as we blame our failure, our challenge, or problem on a co-worker, a friend, or something else, our mind says to itself, I'm off the hook. It's their fault, meaning we can't do anything about it. We can't change it. So why are we bothering to do anything anyway? So in essence, when we put the blame on somebody or something else, we are giving them the power over that situation, reinforcing to ourselves that we have absolutely no power to influence that outcome any longer. Hence, we don't. So by taking responsibility or full ownership, on the other hand, for all the failures, mistakes, and challenges that you created or contributed to, you regain the power to modify the outcome. So when you say to yourself, I create this in some way, I'm responsible for it, you actually have the power to do something. And you're highly motivated to do so as you feel in control, responsible for that result. In other words, you want things to be your responsibility, because that means you actually now have control over that situation to respond effectively and make it better. Now, it may cause a little pain at first until it becomes a psychological norm for you. But in the long term, it causes you massive relief and greater possibility. Plus, it gives you freedom. Now, as Stephen Covey wrote in the hit book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, look at the word responsibility. Responsibility. The ability to respond. Highly proactive people recognize that responsibility. They do not blame circumstances, conditions, or conditioning for their behavior. Their behavior is a product of their own conscious choice, based on values, rather than a product of their conditions, based on feeling. So ultimately, responsibility gives you personal power. As you take responsibility, you gain the power to change things, to make things better, and create the life you choose. And that's how we become powerful, filled with strength and the capacity to make extraordinary things happen. Now, there's one more important distinction to make, is this one. Fault versus responsibility, not the same thing. Fault and responsibility are not the same thing and do not always go together. For example, it may not have been your fault that you were parented in a certain way. You had a bad childhood, or things outside of your control actually happened to you. This wasn't your fault, but it's definitely your responsibility to gain awareness of, to understand, change, reshape, discard if need be, and adapt to the things that happened in your life in order to live the life that you want to live. To find a way. That's your responsibility, even if it wasn't your fault. Did your partner cheat on you? Did you lose a job? Did a rule, a law, or a regulation change, making your life difficult in some way? Even if these things weren't your fault, it doesn't mean you don't have to do anything about them. Far from it. More often than not, it's your responsibility to find out how to best deal with these things to change and adapt to the new circumstances. It may sound harsh, but it has to be said, as it's your life that it's affecting. Fault is about who created the problem. Responsibility is whose job it is to fix it. So, we've covered the why. Let's cover the how. How do you start to take greater responsibility for things in your life? Well, it all starts with this one question for radical responsibility. It's a question that an early mentor of mine taught me, and here's the question. How did I create this? Did someone steal from you? Did you get scammed? Did you lose your life savings in a bad business deal? Did someone betray you? Have you been diagnosed with a life-threatening health condition? So whenever anything bad happens, ask yourself, how did I create this? Now, I must warn you, asking yourself this question can be very painful. Your mind will probably come up with a million reasons, excuses, and distractions not to think about it. And as you read this, you may have even got a little bit offended. You've gone too far, you may think. How is being diagnosed with a life-threatening disease something I created? Or how is someone betraying me or stealing from me something that I created? Remember, it's not your fault, but it's your responsibility to create the best, most fulfilling life for yourself. So, for example, perhaps your diet and exercise and energy hasn't been the best for the last few years before you got diagnosed with that life-threatening health condition or illness. And perhaps this is something you need to take responsibility for and change. So, for someone's story, their mother was diagnosed with early breast stage cancer while they were growing up. And his father was diagnosed with testicular cancer, both parents' cancer. And yes, while they were terrified at the time, instead of blaming and falling into victimhood, despite this hard situation, some would say, wasn't their fault. They decided to look for ways they can take actually responsibility for them, which led to research in health and well-being solutions day in and day out. They took radical levels of responsibility and became obsessed with finding a way out of this, and chose not to go the traditional route of hospitals, medicine, and chemo, which more people are discovering might not be the optimum solution. And years later, they speak of the fear that they had when they first got diagnosed and how they would talk about what would happen to them and their children if cancer got the best of them. And despite this fear, they knew they created this, and in part of therefore they couldn't undo it with their efforts. They changed their thinking first. They completely changed their diets and health habits, which resulted in them totally transforming their health, fitness, and healing themselves of their cancer, over the next 6 to 12 months? Naturally. Yes, it is absolutely possible. We've just been taught that some things are incurable. Now, of course, this isn't medical advice, but merely an example of how their mindset actually helped them go through one of the toughest times in their lives. Now, once again, I'm not saying you should do this or do that. In fact, I actually catch myself falling into blame as well in my own life, at which point I do my best to remind myself of this and actually step back into my personal power. And you can do the same if you choose. And the best place to start is by asking yourself these questions. How did I create this? What can I do about this? What's in my control and how can I create a better income? These questions will help your thinking and assist you to create the better results and a better quality of life across all the important areas of your life. I really hope that you got some good insights from this session today. And I sincerely hope this serves you well.